This is an interesting demonstration of the importance of trying to find appropriate novel research methodologies where you can see things which you couldn't just see with the normal microscope. It's really amazing how these things developed. And my scientific question here is, of course, we are aware that some neural evolutionary development during the early life, also in the embryo and then later on, are defective, and some of them more and more are understood. And are there good ways for prevention at due time?
Well, this is a very good question. The first preventable origins of mental retardation is known, and it is exposure to alcohol in utero. So this is a very simple thing that you can change, is make sure that mothers know that they should not drink during pregnancy. Very simple message. Other drugs, of course. And prematurity. Prematurity is a, well, to some extent, preventable cause of long-lasting cognitive difficulties. It's a very important ethical question, I think, because we are resuscitating very young babies now, you know, at the stage that I was showing you on the very left, you know, when the brain is not even folded. What will happen to those children? They are barely studied. This is a really understudied area of medicine. What happens to premature children later on? We know that they are likely, not always of course, but they are quite likely to develop cognitive difficulties or motor difficulties. So these are, you know, way before genetic disease and so on. These are quite preventable areas.
Thank you. Marcelo?
Well, I want to ask a question more philosophical. As you know, in the history of philosophy, there are two positions, more or less. One is represented by Plato, that says that we have some ideas in the brain, and the other in the soul, but then in the brain. And the other by Aristotle to say that the brain is like a tabula rasa. What is today in the empirical experience? What is the situation?
Right. In just 30 seconds. No, the tabula rasa, I think, is not the right model. And there is more and more data to suggest that the brain is organized, and the brain of different species is organized in different ways that give them different talents, basically. So in the case of space, which is perhaps Kant's first a priori idea, there is very clear evidence for a priori expectations of space. For instance, in very young rats, you already see the beginning of an organization of the place cells and grid cells and head direction cells. These are neurons that allow the animal to navigate in space. They are present either immediately, like the head direction cells, so we have a compass, we are born with a compass, basically, or they are present after 24 hours of beginning to navigate through space. So incredibly quick development of the knowledge of space. So my feeling is that it's the same for the human brain. We have a repertoire of knowledge, one of which is the knowledge of language, and this makes our species very different from the others, but probably from a genetic point of view.
Thank you so much for the beautiful presentation. I would like to ask kind of a gap between molecular levels or genetic basis of those kind of phenomena, say neuronal, like a plasticity or even a recycling. From your perspective, how do you think, how can we go into elucidation of like a gene expression, a protein interaction, molecular levels? And certainly from geneticists, we work on mouse, others experiment. But from your point of view, how do you like to see the perspective of elucidation from molecular level?
Yeah. Well, I am really a cognitive neuroscientist, and I work on the human brain. So these levels are very hard to access in the human brain, although there are some possibilities. So sometimes you have, for instance, in these epilepsy patients, you can remove brain tissue from the patients for clinical purposes, and then molecular biologists can analyze it, or molecular neurobiologists. More generally, I think what is fantastic is the amount of conservation of these plasticity mechanisms. So the mouse model is not at all irrelevant. There are now other models, such as the model of birds, and cognition in birds is remarkably developed, and the model of bird song, learning to sing, has strong parallels to the acquisition of language in humans. And even the genetic mechanisms seem to be, to some extent, parallel. So I think it's like in other domains of medicine, we have a bridge through the fact that evolution has been a conservative mechanism.
The environment, my question concerns could you show the effects on neuronal recycling due to environment? What are the effects that you measure?
Well, yes, I think what I showed are effects of the environment. They are effects of putting the child into a specific school or even in a specific language. This we can directly detect now at the brain level.
I don't understand what means direct detection. What do you measure?
Well, so for instance, the ability of the brain to react to the same exact symbols, a string of letters, will be completely different in children who have been exposed to an environment where these letters are used and an environment in which these letters are not used. So this experiment exists, for instance, there is a nice experiment where you show people Hebrew letters, and the brain reacts in completely different way depending on whether they have learned how to interpret these letters as phonemes. It's quite trivial, I think, but it's very easy to detect at this point.
It's trivial, but it's fundamental.
Yeah.
It's not so obvious.
There are two important functions of language: to identify things and to distinguish between things. I mean, from your experiments and from the point of view of evolutionary processes, could one say they both functions happen at the same time, or is one realized earlier than the other?
Well, the origins of language is really one of the most difficult topics at the moment. I don't think we have a good understanding, because that requires studying just the human brain. There will not be ultimately a very good animal model for that. One thought is the following, is that animals have index systems. So they do have communication, and typically it means that there are certain symbols, maybe I shouldn't use symbols, there are certain objects that map onto concepts. So you know about the system of cries in primates, for instance. They have different cries for an eagle or a leopard. But this functions as indexes to specific concepts. That has a long evolutionary history. What seems to be special in humans is a system of symbols with a syntax. There is no evidence for syntax in a strong sense in other animal species than us. So the idea is that there is a combinatorial system that has developed that may be quite unique. And you know, the experiments where chimps were taught a certain form of language, they achieved the mapping of words onto objects, but they never achieved the combinations of words in a productive sense. At least this is debated, but it looks like it's not achievable by species other than humans. So we are searching now the brain for mechanisms of combinations. And I think combinations in a syntactic structure is quite particular to language, but also to mathematics, to music, to a lot of human activities. So it could be the answer to what makes the human brain very special.
Vicuña is behind me and asked me to.
Yeah, you showed us very nice pictures of the developing brain in children that are being taught how to read. And also you developed a set of principles to improve the learning process. I cannot avoid asking you whether, I am sure there must be images of the aging brain, and whether you have developed principles to keep the brain in good shape. There is popular knowledge, that if you keep reading and studying, the brain behaves better than if you don't do it. So I would like your comment on that.
That's a huge question. I don't work on the aging brain myself. There is, of course, a lot of research. Not yet. But what can I say? No, something that has been discovered is that you can protect the brain from aging. So, the protective factors are in fact early in life. So for instance, I was talking about bilingualism. It seems that people who are bilingual have a delayed onset of the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and other diseases. So it may be that the disease is progressing at the same pace biologically, but the symptoms do not arise at the same age. Anything that augments the flexibility of the brain early on has a protective factor. I think personally that the case of aging is more for, medicine and also nutrition, oxygenation, and so on. But education early on can also be a protective factor.
Nicole Ledoirin.
Techniques to teach reading to the children, the global one and the analytical one. Your studies, your analysis of how the brain develops the capacity to read, can you prefer one or the other one, recommend one of both?
Right, yeah. Now, this debate, I think, is closed now. So the global method doesn't work very well. And the phonics, we call it phonics, the mapping of letters onto sounds, is the method that works the best, at least early on. So the first thing that kids must learn is how the alphabetic principle works. And it is a mapping from the shapes of letters to the sounds. I think we know this very well now. And in fact, I think there is less and less debate about it, but some teachers are simply not informed about it well enough. So teacher training is a strong part, I think, of this improvement of education.
I can take a last question if there is important. Yep, please.
There has recently been a lot of news about the fact that people presented with facts that are contrary to their previous beliefs only become more entrenched in their previous beliefs, which are contrary to facts. And this seems to be quite widespread throughout the humanity. On the other hand, most of the scientists I know are quite willing to change their beliefs when presented with facts, so it doesn't appear to be something that is unchangeable. What I'm wondering is, do you know anything about whether the education of children, whether there are features in the education of children that can change this apparently widespread phenomenon in adults, and maybe even in politicians?
We don't study the politician's brain, but it's too hard. No, it's a wonderful question. The way we think about these issues is that the brain is a statistical machine. It's a Bayesian machine. And so it's trying to do proper statistics, maybe with some biases. So there are interesting studies of why the brain is biased sometimes in its conclusions. But a lot of it has to do with the hierarchy of Bayesian inference. So you may be telling me something, and maybe I should change my beliefs. But also I will, as a social species, I will consider whether you are telling the truth or whether you are well informed. And I think what is happening frequently in this situation is that people draw the inference at the higher level that perhaps they are being misinformed. They don't believe the person who is speaking. So that's one virtue of scientific teaching, is that we learn to doubt our beliefs. And we create this meta-level thinking that we may be wrong. or some people may be wrong. And I think there is a very interesting area of research on metacognition, how we know what we know. And we realize that the brain makes a lot of inferences of this kind. And yes, indeed, you can teach young children to doubt their own beliefs and to be more aware of their own biases. This is only a starting of an area of research which is called the metacognition training in young children.
Well, this leads us immediately to the next talk by Pierre Leda on scientific education.